Hi, folks. How you doing? Have a seat, please. Go ahead and turn to John chapter 13. He was a genius, and we would follow him anywhere. It was 5:30 p.m. at corporate headquarters, and half the IT department had left for home, and all of a sudden, out in the street, half a block away, a water main broke right in the middle of the intersection. And millions of gallons of water gushed out in downtown Cleveland, making a hole 25 feet wide and a crater 10 feet deep, and it was gushing up 5 feet up into the air and making this big mound of water that filled the whole intersection and flooded the buildings next door. And he took charge. He sent one of us down into our basement to see if the water was coming into our basement, and it was. So we've got to shut down the system now. You call the vice president, you go and fax Hong Kong and Sydney and Delhi and Monaco, tell them what's going on, tell them to let the other offices know. We had to do something quickly before the power was shut off in our building. So he took charge without hesitation when the rest of the upper management had already left. He calmed us, he mobilized us, and coordinated a shutdown of the worldwide corporate computer network. He was cool under fire, delegated authority, got the job done efficiently, and averted a crisis. In John, the Gospel of John, chapter 13 through 18, we get a glimpse of what Jesus Christ was like under pressure. We get to see his quote-unquote genius, only it was 100 times better than anyone else, not just genius. We get to see him, as Philippians 2 says, being in the form of God, or as Colossians 2 says, the fullness of the Godhead bodily. So since Lent is starting, we just had Mardi Gras, right? Okay. Since Lent is starting, I thought I'd borrow a subject from Lent and teach an excerpt from my Survey of the Gospel seminar. There are 3 great teachings in the Gospels that Jesus taught. A lot of the things that he taught we just have summaries of and excerpts of, but there are 3 great teachings where we have almost his whole sermon. And they are just tremendous to take a look at. They are the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon in the Plain, and the Sermon in the Valley. They are the bedrock of his ministry and indeed of Christianity. And we have discovered in prior teachings that one of the keys to understanding the Sermon on the Mount was to recognize the repetitions that were in there. They divide it up into sections, and they help point out what Jesus Christ himself wanted to emphasize. For example, from the Sermon on the Mount, remember, blessed, blessed, blessed is one section. Then the other section is, you've heard it's been said, but I say to you. You've heard it's been said, but I say to you. Then there's another section, verily they have their reward. And you can look at those and understand his main points just by seeing what these repetitions indicate. The same is true for what I call the Sermon in the Valley. The Sermon in the Valley is John 13 through 17. There are several sets of repetitions there that point the way to show what Jesus Christ's intent was with the teaching. Now, I believe that the Sermon in the Valley actually begins with the Last Supper because this is indicated by some repetitions, some phrases that are repeated later. For example, in John 13:16, Jesus is teaching the servant is not greater than his Lord. Well, that gets repeated later on in John 15:20. So I think that this sermon, this teaching, actually began at the Last Supper. Also, he tells them, now I tell you before it comes that when the time has come you may believe. That is in John 13:19, and then it's repeated in John 14:29. So I think, again, John 13 is the introduction of the Sermon in the Valley. Now, the Sermon on the Mount was Christianity 101, okay, in that day. Its main message was, be genuine. Have no ulterior motive. Put God first, and everything else will fall in line. The Sermon on the Plain was the practical application of the Sermon on the Mount. It was taught to people who were applying the principles that were taught, and needed a little bit more instruction to overcome some of the things that happen to you when you're practicing something. And then the Sermon in the Valley is a bridge to things to come. It lays the foundation upon which the church after Pentecost is built. And to give you a quick summary of this Sermon in the Valley, in John 13, Jesus Christ vividly portrays the servant is not greater than his Lord by washing their feet. That was something that was just unthinkable for him to do, because he who washed the feet was like the sewer worker today. You know, somebody that you wouldn't want that job, would you? No, it's just the worst job. And for him to do that for them was a great example. It was stunning to them. And he utilized that to finally nail down this one pesky problem that had been coming up over and over again about which of them is the greatest. They kept on coming up, and he kept on pushing it back, and it kept on coming up, and he kept on pushing it back. And finally, just before he knows he's going to be crucified, he had to do it again. He had to vividly, finally, put this thing to rest. And then he deals with Judas, the betrayer. After that, he begins explaining his new commandment, that they love one another. But he gets interrupted during this process by Peter and Thomas and Philip in John 14. And then he digresses a bit, handles their situation. And then he introduces the concept of the comforter, that the paraclete, okay, the comforter, which is the motivator, the encourager, the catalyst, the Holy Spirit. That's what was going to happen after Pentecost. And then in John 15, he encourages them to remain faithful, to abide in him, to keep his commandments, namely the commandment that they love one another. And then in John 16, he further explains that he has to go away for a little while. And that phrase actually was introduced in John 13. So again, it's more proof that John 13 is part of this whole development. Then in John 17, he commends his disciples to God for protection and prays for their unity and love, and that's the end of the teaching. And then John 18 begins with his personal agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then gives the details of his betrayal and his arrest. The repetitions that are in the Sermon in the Valley, there's a sevenfold repetition of a phrase. And if you look at John 14:25, here is the first occurrence of it. John 14:25. These things have I spoken unto you. Then in John 15:11, these things have I spoken unto you. Then, an even stronger form of it, John 15:17, these things have I commanded you. You see the repetition? John 16:1, these things have I spoken unto you. 16:4 is these things have I told you. There's another one of them. 16:25, these things have I spoken unto you. And John 16:33, these things have I spoken unto you. So, these repetitions indicate his real intent for this teaching. Because if you go back and look, after most of them, there is a purpose clause. It says that, and it gives the purpose. So, John 15:11, these things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you. 15:17, these things have I spoken unto you, that you love one another. 16:1, he says these things that you should not be offended or caused to stumble. See, Jesus knew what was about to happen. He knew that he was going to be arrested. He knew that he was going to be crucified. He knew that he was going to die. And they weren't ready for that. He knew that their world was going to be shaken, that everything was going to be turned upside down. And so here is the Sermon in the Valley. He's teaching as much as he can to them to prepare them for this agony that they would have to go through, because they would have to come out on the other side intact, or otherwise most of the work that he had put in for his ministry that year would have gone for naught. If they would not have emerged after the crucifixion and the resurrection intact, ready to move forward again, it would have fallen apart. You see? And so the real purpose of this teaching is shown by these clauses. that my joy might remain in you, that you love one another, that you should not be offended. 16:4. That you may remember. Okay? 16:25. He goes on, he says, well, I'm going to tell you plainly. And then in 16:33, that in me you might have peace. You see how these repetitions really show what this sermon in the valley was for? He was trying to prepare them for what was about to occur. Take a look at John 16:32. John 16 and in verse 32. Behold, the hour comes, yea, it's now come, it's imminent, that you shall be scattered, every man to his own, and shall leave me alone. But I'm not alone, because the Father is with me. See, he wanted to teach them this stuff so that they'd make it through that. See? Another key to understanding the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon in the Valley, and the Sermon on the Plain is to understand the circumstances under which they were taught. And that's true with the Sermon in the Valley as well. When we understand the circumstances under which this was taught, it will really arouse and bring out the pathos of this situation, where you can see the raw emotion and everything that was involved, where Jesus will come to life off of the pages. So let's go to John 13 and begin. John 13, I've been in this section before, but it's just so powerful. It's just so beautiful. John 13:1 says, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And that's what this is all about. We'll see that that was true. He loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil now having put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God and went to God, rose from supper, laid aside his outer garments, and took a towel and girded himself. Jesus Christ knew that he would depart out of the world. He knew that his hour was come. That's really tremendous to understand, because Jesus Christ, the greatest and the best person that ever lived, shared something that only the worst people know. And that was, he knew when he was going to die, just like somebody on death row. The very best shared something that only the very worst know. Do you know when you're going to die? No. Well, if you did know, and it was going to be next week, how would you handle the situations that confronted Jesus? How would you be able to get these 12 apostles together, make sure that they made it through? Well, Jesus did, and the way that he handled it is just amazing. And these next chapters give us an opportunity to see him, to see his heart, to see his character. We can catch a glimpse of him as he was, breathtaking, inspiring, and pure, the Son of God. But that's not all, because also it says in verse 3, Jesus, knowing the Father had given all things into his hands. The ball was in his court. It was the final seconds of the game. The ball was passed to him, and he would have to make the winning shot. What kind of pressure was that? All things were in his hands. In other words, he knew that everything now depended upon what he was going to do next. All the preparations of the prophets, all the promises of God, all the administrations, everything that God had done up to this point now depended on what he was going to do. Would he be successful or would he fail? If he failed, everything would be for naught. How would you like that kind of pressure? Not just a basketball game with the final shot, but all eternity. How could you handle that pressure? And later on at the Garden of Gethsemane, you see the raw emotion. You see his agony. And it definitely had to be an undercurrent. I mean, you just can't turn that stuff on and off like a faucet, can you? He had to be dealing with it. And that's what makes this Sermon in the Valley so amazing. The pressure he must have been under. He knew when he was going to die. He knew that if he failed, all the preparations of the prophets and all of eternity would have gone for naught. What would you do under those circumstances? How would you handle it? Could you teach the servant is not greater than his Lord under those circumstances and finally put that pesky problem that would keep coming back up all the time? Which of you is the greatest? They would argue about themselves, and the sons of Zebedee, the mother had to go up and ask Jesus, can you do me a favor? Grant the ones in your left hand and ones in your right. Remember that? That just kept on coming up, and he finally just had to squelch it the best way he could. Well, Jesus did so because he loved them unto the end. And then Judas, how would you handle that under all that pressure? What would you do? Well, you know what Jesus did? See, Judas believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Why was he doing this? Well, Jesus wasn't very Messiah-like as far as Judas was concerned, because Judas expected the military Messiah that was going to come and kick butt and kick the Romans out and set up the new kingdom. That's what he expected. And Jesus was not acting very Messiah-like. So what he wanted to do is arrange a confrontation between Jesus and the high priests. He figured that if he cornered Jesus, then Jesus would have to kick butt. That's what I believe was going on. Well, Judas was trying to be the finger of God, you know what I mean? And throughout all the ages, everyone who has ever tried to be the finger of God gets the finger from God. And Jesus had to handle that. But he gave him the sop, right? Remember? He gave him the sop. It's just like the toast in a meal today. You toast the honored guest. And Jesus gave that sop to Judas and looked into his eyes as if to say, you don't have to do this. What are you doing this for? How would you handle that situation under all that pressure? Verse 31, John 13. Therefore, when he was gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God be glorified in him, God shall also glorify him in himself, and shall straightway glorify him. And that's what got Jesus through what he was going to have to do. He saw the joy that was set before him. And he said in verse 33, little children, yet a little while, and I am with you. You shall seek me, and as I said to the Jews, where I go, you can't come. So now I say to you, a new commandment I give to you. This is the main subject of the Sermon in the Valley, the new commandment, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that you love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples. This shall be the telling trait. This shall be the earmark, that you love one another. But verse 36, Simon Peter interrupted. How would you like to be Jesus, trying to teach them this crash course on what they need to know under all this pressure, knowing that you're going to die and everything's in your court, and now Peter interrupts. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus answered him, where I go, you can't follow me now, but you shall follow me afterwards. And Peter said, Lord, why can't I follow you now? Can't you get it, Peter? Shut up. No, he didn't say that, did he? And Peter said, I'll lay down my life for your sake. And Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly I say to you, the cock shall not crow till thou hast denied me thrice. Good old Peter. Here's Jesus trying to introduce one of the main subjects of this crash course, this Sermon in the Valley that he has to teach him, and Peter interrupts him. How would you handle that with a death sentence over your head? Shut up, Peter. I've got Excedrin headache, number 532. No. Don't you understand? We don't have much time here. Don't you know what's coming? No. Jesus had enough composure to get revelation and say, before the cock crows, you shall deny me thrice. How could you do that? He's our example. And he did it because he loved Peter unto the end. Chapter 14. There's just so much that one could teach in this section. It's just so full. And all I want to do is sort of do an overview of it because there's just so much here. Chapter 14, verse 1. Now Jesus begins to teach something so beautiful. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. And these words were familiar to them because they are part of the marriage vow of that time. Just as popular as for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, etc., right? Okay? And as he begins speaking this, he's talking about love, that they love one another, and this is just so beautiful. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions, and if it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And where I go, you know, and the way, you know. And then Thomas interrupts him. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going, and how can we know the way? How did Jesus handle this? Shut up, Thomas. Write down your question and ask me later. Stop thinking, Thomas. Just listen to me, because I have the answers. No. Look, man, you just busted my mind picture I was building. No. Jesus loved questions. And John 14 illustrates how he taught. He invited questions, and then he incorporated them into his teaching. Today we call that the Socratic method of teaching. Socrates, the philosopher, used it. See, Jesus didn't lead by intimidation. Any idiot can become a dictator, and if he's able to amass enough power, he can silence his critics. But Jesus was not an unprepared, autocratic, and unloving teacher who saw questions as a threat to his authority. He wasn't raising parrots. He wanted people to think while he was teaching. And questions help a teacher nail down what they're teaching. Questions help the teacher focus or clarify or solidify their points. Questions are feedback that show a teacher how effective they are and how they've been in communicating their intended topic. Was it a stupid question? Where are you going? And how can we know the way? Good old Thomas, the same apostle who later doubted his resurrection. How would you handle that with a death sentence over your head? How much mental time and effort would you put into forming an answer when you knew there were just seconds left in the ball game and the ball was in your hands and you had to make the last shot? What is a stupid question? How can we know the way? It's only the universal heart cry of every seeker. How can we know the way? How can I know the way? How can I make sure I'm on the right path? Jesus didn't brush it off, and we're glad he didn't. Go away, kid, you bother me. He didn't give a shallow answer. Good old Thomas, the one who doubted him, but good old Thomas later, the apostle who started the first church of India. Jesus thought for a moment and then spoke. He said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes unto the Father but by me. If you'd known me, you would have known my Father also, and from henceforth you know him and have seen him. Wow, what an answer! That answer made the top 10 list of the greatest statements of all time. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes unto the Father by me. Good old Thomas. Thanks, Thomas, for asking that question. And thanks, Jesus, for your loving answer. Could you do that with a death sentence over your head? Jesus did. And he loved Thomas to the end. And we now have that great focus of truth, that great inspiring statement, the top 10. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes into the Father but by me. When you understand the pathos, the emotion, everything that was going on, the undercurrent beneath that statement, it makes it shine ever so brightly. So now Philip interrupts. Jesus is trying to do this crash course. And Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father and it's good enough for us. You know? So Philip chimes in with a remark. Well, what did Jesus do? He loved Philip to the end. He dealt with his remark. And out of that, we get John 14:12. Verily I say to you, he that believes on me, the works that I do shall he do also, and greater works than these shall he do, because I go unto my Father. Wow. Could you come up with something like that under all that pressure? Jesus did, because he loved them to the end. Was Philip's remark a snide remark? Just show us the Father and it'll be good enough for us. Well, there's only a heart cry of every believer. Don't you want to see God? Moses did. Show me your hind parts. Jesus, the desire of all the nations. Jesus loved Philip to the end, and out of that we got John 14:12. Isn't that amazing? And also, he says, and whatsoever you shall ask in my name, verse 13, that I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask anything in my name, I will do it. How inspiring has that been throughout all the ages? And it was the response of a remark, an interruption to his teaching that Jesus didn't brush off. I'm glad he didn't brush it off, because now we have these great, inspiring statements that are so tremendous. So now he gets back onto the subject after getting Peter and Thomas and Philip to track with him. In verse 15, if you love me, keep my commandments. And this is the main message of the Sermon in the Valley. The word command or commandment is used 9 times in this sermon. And also the phrase, my commandments, his commandments. This is one of the central topics. You love one another, and this is my commandment. And then in verse 16, he talks about the Comforter. And I will pray the Father that he will give you another Comforter, that he may abide with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it sees him not, neither knows him. But you know him, for he dwells with you and shall be in you. You see the difference before Pentecost and after Pentecost when it comes to Holy Spirit? Before, it was upon them, it was with them. After the day of Pentecost, it was in them. See it? Verse 18, I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you. Yet a little while, and the world sees me no more. But you see me, because I live, you shall live also. And that day you shall know that I am in my Father, and ye in me, and I in you. He that hath my commandments and keeps them, he it is that loves me. And he that loves me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him, and will manifest myself to him. Wow. And then Judas said to him. Now this Judas is not Iscariot, because Judas Iscariot had already left. How is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? Now, this apostle, if you compare the lists of the apostles in Matthew 10 and Mark 3 and Acts 1:13 and Luke 6:16, this Judas was another name for Thaddeus. Okay? But what a question. See, this question was tracking right with his teaching. It wasn't like an interruption. It wasn't like a digression. And Judas said to him, and I have the same question, don't you? Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? You know, lots of people want to see Jesus, right? Do you want to see him today, after the day of Pentecost? Me too. Well, here's how. I mean, he appeared to people many times, but that's the exception, not the rule. You know? Jesus is busy. You want to make an appointment? How can you see him? What is the primary way? Jesus gives us the answer in verse 23. Here it is. Jesus answered and said to him, if a man love me, he will keep my words, and my Father will love him, and we will come unto him and make our abode with him. That's how he will manifest himself to us and not to the world. I'll read it again. If a man love me, he will keep my words. Okay? If you love the Lord Jesus Christ, you'll do what he says, right? And if you do that, if you do what he says, if you practice the word, and my Father will love him, and we will come unto him and make our abode with him. Verse 24, he that loves me not keeps not my sayings. And by the way, if you don't like that, the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father's which sent me. Okay? Do you want to see Jesus? Do you want to have him manifested to you? Then get busy walking as he walked. Get busy speaking as he spoke. Get busy thinking as he thought. And then you will see facets of him in you. We will come and manifest. We will come and make our abode with him. See it? You have Christ in you, don't you? Well, then manifest it. And you'll get to see what he was like in you. You will get to see what he was like in others as they walk on the word. You understand? As everybody in the body works together, you'll see facets of him over here. You'll see facets of him over there. And together you'll see what Christ was like. That's how that's the main way of him manifesting himself to us. The other thing is believing for the shortcut, you know. Jesus might appear to one of you. Great. But it's his prerogative, not yours. You understand? Can't you see him in you at times? Well, dare to walk as he walked, and you'll see more. Verse 25, these things have I spoken unto you, being yet present with you. But the Comforter, which is the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he shall teach you all things and bring all things to your remembrance whatsoever I have said unto you. That's a great thing to believe for, isn't it? Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Not as the world gives, give I unto you. Don't let your heart be troubled. Don't let it be afraid. You see the intent of the Sermon on the Valley? You've heard how I said to you, I go away and come again unto you. If you loved me, you would rejoice because I said that I go unto my Father. For my Father is greater than I. And now I have told you before it's come to pass, that when it is come to pass, you might believe. Hereafter I will not talk much with you, for the prince of this world comes and hath nothing in me. But that the world may know that I love the Father, and as the Father gave me commandment, so, even so do I give you commandment. Arise, let's move. So now they're moving out of the they're up at the top of the mountain at Mount Zion, where they had the Last Supper, and now they're going to walk down the hill and turn the corner to the left and end up at the Garden of Gethsemane. I was there along with some of you in Jerusalem a few years back, and we walked these same steps. We started up at the Mount Zion, where they believe that the Last Supper was held. And, you know, there's a lot of things in Jerusalem. They have shrines for everything. And they have churches built upon churches built upon churches. And nothing there is really what it was like back at the time of Jesus Christ, except for a very few things. And two of the things are involved with this sermon in the valley. One of them are the steps that Jesus walked down, because this hill, it's like a 20 or 30 degree hill, I believe, something like that, and it goes down for about a quarter of a mile from the top of Mount Zion all the way down into the valley where the brook Kidron is. And the corner of the temple, there's this wall right here for the temple, and then there's a corner. It's not truncated like this, but there's a corner. You can see it jutting out, and they're walking down the hill right here on this side. The Garden of Gethsemane is over here. You've heard of the Wailing Wall? Okay, it's right here. There's this one part of the wall of the temple, because on the top of the temple area right now, there's the Dome of the Rock Mosque, that big golden domed thing, and that's off limits to the Jews. And so the closest they can get is this Wailing Wall right here. So here he is, he's walking down, and the steps are still there. They're genuine. Those steps are still there. And he was walking down through here, and then over here is the Garden of Gethsemane. And what is remarkable to me about this particular teaching is that there were 12 men that were walking down that hill together, and Jesus was teaching them the Sermon in the Valley. And in John 15, there are 12 repetitions of a word. And, you know, I know this is personal interpretation, but I believe that what happened is that he spoke each of these 12 words to each of the 11 men that were going down one at a time, and then one to himself, because it just fits so beautifully. And the first time I taught this was in Jerusalem at the Garden of Gethsemane. And afterwards, you know, I wanted one of those leaves from one of the trees in the Garden of Gethsemane, but, you know, I couldn't take one. I couldn't pick one. They had a fence around it anyway, because if everybody took a leaf, they'd be dead. And so I taught this, what I'm about to teach to you, about the 12 men that were walking down together, and the 12 repetitions of the word remain, abide, dwell, be faithful. And afterwards, I looked down, and here on the sidewalk, beside the sidewalk, were 3 olive leaves. One for me, one for my wife, and one for my daughter. And here's one of them right here. Afterward, they were there. And they came from one of the biggest trees. So they came from a tree that saw him. I think that tree was still there when he was there, because it's so old. It's being held up by fence, by posts and stuff. They're so old in there. But in John 15, Jesus taught them, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. And he knew what was going to happen. He knew that he was going to be crucified and arrested. He knew that they as sheep were going to be scattered. And he's trying to leave them with something. Every branch that's in me and bears not fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he cleanses it, purges it, that it may bring forth more fruit. You know how you get rid of all the suckers on a tree, and the next season it just brings forth beautiful amounts of fruit? Verse 3, and now you are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Abide in me. And the word abide, remain, dwell, be faithful, remain, is repeated 12 times. And there were 12 men going down together. Abide in me. I believe, just knowing what I know from Jesus, from the Word, and seeing him between the lines, I believe he looked straight into each of their hearts as he beheld them, and their face, their eyes met. He was saying goodbye, and at the same time, he was giving each of them something to go on through the tough times. Abide in me, and I in you. As a branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it, number 2, abide in the vine. No more can you, except you, number 3, abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He that, number 4, abides, remains, dwells, stays faithful through thick and thin in me, and I in him, the same brings forth much fruit. For without me, you can't do anything. If a man, number 5, abide not in me, he's cast forth as a branch, and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they're burned. If you, number 6, abide in me, and my words, number 7, abide in you, you shall ask what you will, and it will be done unto you. Herein is my Father glorified, that you bring much fruit. So shall you be my disciples. As the Father hath loved me, so I loved you. Number 8, abide, continue, remain, dwell, stay faithful, ye in my love. If you keep my commandments, you shall, number 9, abide in my love, even as I have kept my commandments, and, speaking of himself, number 10, I abide in his love. Verse 15, or chapter 15, verse 11, these things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might, number 11, abide, remain, dwell in you, and that your joy might be full. Isn't that remarkable? 11 of them so far, one referring to himself. These things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might abide or remain or dwell in you, that your joy might be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do whatsoever I command you. And he goes on talking. Well, what about the one remaining apostle? What about him? How would you feel if you were him and Jesus had gone with all the other ones and said that, and you were the last one left, and he's going on, and he's, Jesus, what about me? He says, you are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. Henceforth I call you not servants, for the servant knows not what his Lord is doing, but I have called you friends, for all things that I have heard of my Father I have made known unto you. Well, Jesus, what about me? You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit. Jesus, what about me? And that your fruit should abide. That whatsoever you shall ask of the Father in my name, he may give it you. What about me, Jesus? Well, what about you? Will you be faithful? Will you remain in him? Will you continue with him in fellowship through thick and thin? Can't you see him? Do you now see him more clearly because of what we've seen in this teaching? Do you love him now more dearly? Well then, will you follow him more nearly? Because he indeed loved you unto the end. Bless you.